Well, it's the bewitching hour, and so we're going to get started. My name is Kathy Speck, and I'd like to welcome you to the first lecture in our 10th annual lecture series. And we're very pleased to have been at it quite this long, and that means that over the years, we've presented at least 40 really great local history stories. Now, I have a little bit of housekeeping to do. As usual, if you have a cell phone or a pager with you, would you please make sure that it is silenced? And the auditorium staff has asked me to have you note the locations of the exits marked with the lighted exit signs to the front and rear of the auditorium house. In the event of a fire or alarm, please proceed in an orderly manner to the nearest exit. Be aware that the accessible exits are all located in the rear of the house. If there are patrons in wheelchairs or using walkers, please assist them by clearing the aisle and allowing them to exit first. A patron in a non-motorized wheelchair in the front of the house may need assistance getting up the ramp to the lobby. Thank you from the auditorium staff. We hope you had a chance to browse our gift shop a little bit in the lobby. There are several new items out there, especially some new just for the sesquicentennial last year. And the shop will remain open after the lecture if you need a little longer to look. And also hope that you threw your name into the door prize drawing, or we're going to prevail on Shannon at the end of the program to pull out one name. And the prize tonight is a bag of that absolutely delicious Onondaga blend coffee. Now, you may have noticed, if you've been following our lecture series that used to be on Tuesday nights, that we're trying something a little different with the schedule, alternating Tuesdays and Thursdays. And we hope that that works well for all of you that follow our series. And if you have some comments on this schedule experiment that you would like us to hear, please track down one of us and let us know what your opinions are. Now, I wanted to make one very important change, and we want to make sure that you have noticed that. Our June lecture has been changed from Tuesday, June 30th to Tuesday, June 16th due to a scheduling conflict by the speakers. Please make sure to make that change on your calendars, and if you picked up the flyer for the lecture series in the lobby, you'll notice that that fourth lecture is highlighted in yellow as to the date change. We really regret having to do this, but we hope that this is enough advance notice so that you can accommodate that change. Now, I know that you'll enjoy tonight's program, and there are hundreds of local history stories as interesting as the one that you're going to hear tonight. But putting them together takes time and resources. Memberships in the Ames Historical Society provide those resources. If you are not a member, we hope you'll consider becoming a member to ensure the preservation of our collective past. We sincerely thank those in the audience who are already members. Your faithful annual support provides essential funding for everything that we do. And I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Shannon Bardole. You may actually remember from our series 2 years ago when she spoke about the mayors of Ames, or you may recognize her from her day job at the United Way office. Shannon is one of our most faithful volunteers, coming in weekly to undertake in-depth projects. Now, she has told us before about her childhood growing up when her mother dragged her to every museum in every town that they ever visited, and somehow it managed to have clicked. Now, Shannon got her degree in family services at University of Northern Iowa, but one of her first professional positions was working as an interpreter at Living History Farms. So she really got the full immersion experience at the farms. And she has a home-based business making brooms with vintage equipment. This is the real broom straw type brooms. And Hy-Vee Drugstore on Main Street actually carries her goods. So if you see a handmade looking broom that has a label saying Franklin Broom Company on it, that's Shannon. Hard at it. So please welcome Shannon as she tells the story of George Judisch, longtime Ames businessman and veterinary college teacher. Please welcome Shannon.
I was going to ask for a show of hands to see who remembers George Judisch's drugstore, but I'm just going to have to trust that you're doing it because I can't see anything up here. Do any of you remember George or his drugstore? I'm hearing some, okay, good. Well, 2 years ago, to the date, I did give a presentation about the mayors of Ames, and I had kind of started to wonder what my next project was going to be at the Historical Society. And before I had a chance to actually physically leave this stage, someone else, another volunteer, had come up to me and said, "Hey, we have a new project for you. Could you research this pharmacist by the name of George Judisch?" So what I've come to learn is that research is never done. And as soon as the Tribune gets all of its oldest newspapers digitized, I'm going to have to readdress this project to learn everything else that there is to learn from the Tribune prior to 1925. In the meanwhile, I was able to find a lot of references to George Judisch in many newspapers throughout the state of Iowa from 1896 until 1966, which was 7 years after his death. Just a second. Oops, hang on. It's got to be on first. Alex told me that. That works better. There we go. Okay. So George's parents, Ludwig Ferdinand and Catherine Elizabeth Judisch, were married in Muscatine, Iowa in 1858 after she immigrated from Germany the year prior. They came to the United States after experiencing political intolerance. Ludwig fought for the Union Army during the Civil War. George was the fifth of 5 children born to Ludwig and Catherine on November 28, 1869, although 2 of his sisters passed away within days of each other prior to his birth, so he was raised the youngest of 3 boys. We were fortunate enough to have been sent some photographs of the family's Bible. Unfortunately, I don't read German, so the photo on the screen is what I believe to be the statement of marriage between Ludwig and Catherine. These photos were also contained within the family Bible, but there were no identifying labels attached to the photos to know who they are. Now, if you attended my previous lecture, you may recall that I like a little bit of audience participation, so I'm going to quiz you a few times tonight to see how well you know, or perhaps how well you can guess, facts about George. So, before I tell you about the drugstore, can you guess the name of the drugstore? I want you to raise your hand when you think it's the right answer. Was it Judisch & Son, Judisch Brothers, Judisch & Judisch? Oh, I like applause. Maybe we should applaud. There we go. Or was it Westerman and Arnold? And the answer for which I heard the applause is correct. I'm assuming that was either Jim or someone from his family. So Judisch Brothers was the name of the store. Judisch & Judisch was the name of the law firm of Lewis and Clara, which was George's son and daughter-in-law. Westerman and Arnold was actually the name of the drugstore that George purchased on Main Street. Now, there was a reason that the drugstore was called Judisch Brothers. George's brothers became an important part of his business when it came time for new furniture for his store. According to George's granddaughter, Jan, her great-uncles were both master carpenters and built all the fixtures for the pharmacy on Main Street. When Jan took a role remodeling the building approximately 75 years later, she discovered they had used traditional German carpentry using wooden joints and pegs, but no nails. In honor of the help from Albert and Henry, George's pharmacy was named Judisch Brothers Drugstore. You may be able to decipher the name Judisch Brothers circled in red on the photo. As you can see, the drugstore was located at 209 Main Street on the north side of the street between Douglas Avenue and Kellogg Avenue. The current business that's in that location is It's All About Me. George was apparently blessed with a business mind and not the same carpentry skills as his brothers. The February 25th, 1920 edition of the Ames Daily Tribune and Ames Evening Times quipped, "George Judisch had quite a time this morning in setting up a new cigar counter which arrived at his drugstore. George is by far a better pharmacist than a joiner." At the age of 30, George married Lillian Ressler Hunter, 3 years his junior. Nearly 9 years after marrying, their first and only child, Louis Hunter Judisch, was born. This is Louis's senior photo from the Ames High Spirit. Lewis, at age 27, married Clara Grace Mann. Together, they gave George 2 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, none of whom were fortunate enough to have met their grandmother before she passed away in 1928 at the age of 55. We have been fortunate enough to have been joined tonight by Jim, George's youngest grandson, whom we will hear from later. Before I tell you about George and his legacy in Ames, I want to tell you about his talented wife, Lillian. She was very active in her short life as a leader and musician. She served as director of the choir of the Congregational Church and taught in public schools in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and in Ames. She served on the board, working her way up to the president of the Iowa Federation of Music Clubs. She was also very active in many social clubs, including a faculty women's club, the Ames Women's Club, PEO, Eastern Star, the Book and Basket Club, and the Ames Garden Club. She was well known for her many vocal performances, including those at the Faculty Women's Club, PTA meetings, the dedications of Mary Greeley Hospital and the Ames Public Library, and congregational church functions. Lillian served as secretary of the Iowa Federation of Music Clubs in 1923. She was responsible for arrangements for the biennial meeting, including accommodations and credentials for the club presidents and delegates. She also presided at sessions of the biennial meetings. She was elected as first vice president later that year. She traveled to Mount Vernon, Des Moines, Iowa City, and Cedar Rapids as part of her Iowa Federation of Music Clubs leadership responsibilities. Lillian was elected president of the Iowa Federation of Music Clubs in 1925, leading a board of 6 other women. While president-elect, she presented an invitation to the Iowa Federation of Music Clubs to bring the annual convention here to Ames, which was successful, being held in March of 1927. She was instrumental in the establishment of an active artist bureau, which would make it possible for some especially good young talent to be heard throughout the country. Under her leadership, the annual conventions of the Iowa Federation of Music Clubs and the Iowa Music Teachers Association merged. This model followed the example of many other states. During this convention, she encouraged participation in state contests to be able to send a representative to the national music competition. She announced that a statewide contest in Cedar Rapids would offer a prize of $25 in each of 8 classifications, including vocal and instrumental performances for contestants under the age of 24. The winners would move to a district, then possibly the national competition in Philadelphia in November. At the request of Mrs. Judisch, as a representative of the Iowa Federation of Music Clubs, the governor of Iowa, John Hamill, stated in a proclamation to designate May 2nd through the 8th, 1926, as Music Week for Iowa. To comply with the National Music Week Committee's request, she appointed a local committee to oversee the observance of National Music Week in Ames. On a more personal note, Jan Judisch, granddaughter of Lillian, claimed her grandmother was considered an artist who attended social gatherings for women that included painting and singing. Jan remains in possession of 2 pictures that her grandmother painted. Jan also told a story that would perhaps allude to her grandmother's stubbornness. The story Jan told was that Lillian wanted a car, but George thought a car would be a waste of money. So she purchased a car and planned to build a garage with her own money. Since the garage was to be built on property that was in George's name, he charged her monthly rent. In order to pay rent to her husband, she had a double garage built and rented out half of it. According to the county assessor's website, the garage at 808 Douglas Avenue today is not the building that Mrs. Judisch had built. Sadly, Mrs. Judisch passed away at the age of 55 of cancer. Her death was so prominent that her obituary was at the top of the front page of the Ames Daily Tribune and Ames Evening Times on January 7th, 1928. She was so respected in the community that the music division of the Faculty Women's Club postponed their annual party on account of her death, and the Ames Women's Club had a program during one of their meetings in her memory. George Judisch was very well known in the community. He was a professor at Iowa State College, owned a pharmacy on Main Street, served on the boards of the Library, Hospital, and Union National Bank, was very active in the Republican Party, and served as a guest speaker for many service clubs from the time he moved to Ames in 1894 until he passed away in 1959. He was also known for his local philanthropic efforts. George attended the public school in Muscatine. He began his pharmaceutical apprenticeship in 1884 at the C.A. Bush Drugstore in Muscatine. He passed the state pharmacy exam and began working for Harlan Brothers Pharmacists in Des Moines in 1889. He received an honorary degree of Doctor of Pharmacy from Highland Park College of Pharmacy in 1919. It was reported in September 1900 that George was appointed as an instructor at Iowa State College. This photo is from the 1905 edition of The Bomb, Iowa State's yearbook. George is top and center. He taught materia medica and pharmacy in the veterinary department for 26 years. During that time, he outlined a standard materia medica test book for use in colleges. George must have had good rapport with his students. The Ames Daily Tribune noted that vet students would sit in the store around the pot-bellied stove talking vet medicine. According to George's grandson, Jim, George Washington Carver worked at the Judisch brothers while he was a student at Iowa State. Both George and his son Louis would talk about him in years to come. George Washington Carver, of course, is well known for being the first black student at Iowa State and the many uses he devised for the peanut. Jim also told a story of his grandfather's philanthropy helping numerous young people. George sent Johnny Roach to pharmacy school and paid for many of his books, tuition, and expenses. Johnny worked for George until he retired, then opened an apothecary shop in direct competition. This page from the Ames Daily Tribune in 1954 shows both pharmacies' ads on the same page. The Judisch ad on the bottom left and the apothecary shop on the top right. The oldest catalog found in the Veterinary Physiology and Pharmacology Department was for the 1910-11 school year. George was listed as a lecturer. He taught pharmacy to juniors as 2 lectures and a 2-hour lab per week during one semester, and materia medica to juniors for 2 hours a week during the other semester. In 1925, he gave up teaching pharmacy and materia medica to Dr. H.D. Bergman. He established a scholarship awarded each year to the best senior student in veterinary medicine, consisting of 4 years membership in the American Veterinary Medical Association and a subscription to their official journal worth $25. Newspaper articles highlighted this award to students across the state and nation many times while he was living, as well as after he had passed away. The History of Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State College by C.H. Stang stated about George, in order to better equip himself, he studied veterinary physiology, materia medica, poisonous plants, and took some work in agricultural chemistry. He was always ready to help the students out of class and laboratory hours, as well as during the scheduled periods. Many a veterinary student has spent hours at his drugstore downtown receiving helpful suggestions and advice. This written history also stated that George was given the honor of a PhD from Des Moines University. Long before owning his own pharmacy or serving as a leader in the Iowa Pharmaceutical Association, George received his early training from W.C.A. Bush's drugstore in Muscatine. Muscatine remained proud of George and his accomplishments despite moving out of the community in 1889. This was noted by the many times George was mentioned in Muscatine's newspaper, even within the decade prior to George's death. George Judisch was a well-known businessman in the community. He opened Judisch Brothers Pharmacy at 209 Main Street in 1894 in the former Westerman and Arnold Pharmacy. This Westerman and Arnold ad comes from January of 1894. The ads I saw from the Ames Intelligencer newspaper in August of that year noted that Judisch Brothers was formerly Westerman and Arnold. This ad reads, The new firm of Judisch Brothers, successors to Westerman and Arnold. No let-up, no inconvenience because of change of ownership. A shopper's paradise, a full lines of drugs and druggist sundries. This is your harvest time. Don't go away empty-handed. Just a month later, no longer did the ad show the tie to Westerman and Arnold. A few of George's business colleagues were mentioned in the newspaper. He employed David Anderson as a clerk. Milton C. Sayers was his business partner from 1904 to 1907. And Louis Bass was hired as a pharmacist in 1954. George was a leader in the business community. When asked what the greatest need of Ames was in 1921, he was quoted as saying, "The policy this year for the Ames businessman should be to buy with care and judgment, to endeavor to do business with their own money, and to pay and collect promptly. A program of this kind is bound to solve a lot of the business problems that have been so common during the last 4 years." According to George's grandson, Jim, George served as the chief anesthetist to Dr. Hannawalt, who provided medical care to workers in Rock Island Railroad accidents. Jim stated there were stories of horrific scenes due to the coupling devices and the need to amputate limbs. Jim also shared that his grandfather was a master truss fitter, and the drugstore had a small room containing a truss table for designing and fitting the custom devices. So, Jim, you can't answer this one. Does anybody know what trusses were used to treat? And just holler out the answer if you know. Hernias. Very good. I didn't know that. The Judisch Brothers Pharmacy was featured many times in the Ames Daily Tribune after George's son and daughter-in-law, Louis and Clara, became the owners and remodeled, stating of its long, dependable, and ethical history. The store was remodeled during George's 70th year in the pharmacy business. It was quite an advancement to have installed new shelving to make the store semi-self-serve. George continued to spend time at the store to keep informed of the business. The articles boasted of the variety of products available within the modern, updated store, including sick room supplies, baby items, patented medicine and prescriptions, cosmetics and fragrances, candy, stationery, photography supplies, and of course, a fountain. George was seen as a reputable businessman due to his involvement with the State Board of Pharmacy Commissioners and the Iowa Pharmacy Association. George was first nominated as president of the association in June 1920 in Cedar Rapids. The vote was held via mail the following February. Although this was not a common practice, it was believed that a mail vote would be more representative of the 4,000 members of the association. The nominations were also announced in the Muscatine and Iowa City newspapers. George was officially elected at the following association meeting in March in Des Moines. While president in 1922, George urged all Iowa druggists to go on record for the enforcement of the Volstead Prohibition Act. Prohibition lasted in the United States from 1919 to 1933. At the 1923 annual meeting of the Iowa Pharmaceutical Association in February, George was elected to the executive board as the past president. George's leadership continued as Governor Nathan Kendall appointed him as a state pharmacy commissioner in 1922 for a 3-year term. During his first year, he was compensated $10 per day with a limit of 90 days a year. As a member of the Commission of Pharmacy, which became known as Pharmacy Examiners a few years later, his responsibilities as described in the Iowa Official Register of 1923 to 1924 were as follows. Members of the board are appointed for a term of 3 years, 1 member each year. Each person who shall desire to conduct the business of selling at retail, compounding, or dispensing drugs, etc., for medical use must be a registered pharmacist and their names registered in a book kept by the board for that purpose, showing also their residence, together with the date of issuing their certificate. Fee examination and certificates, $5. The license fee for itinerant vendor of drugs is $100 a year, and they are transferable upon assignment and payment of a fee of $1 to the secretary of the board. The penalty for selling without a vendor license is not less than $100 nor more than $200. In May 1923, the State Board of Pharmacy Commissioners elected George as president. The next month, he began to examine candidates for registration to practice in Iowa with 3 other pharmacy board members. Governor John Hamill approved him to be a member of the Pharmacy Commission beginning January 1st, 1925 for 3 years. During his second term as a pharmacy commissioner and as a pharmacy examiner, George continued to earn $10 per day with a maximum of $1,200 per year. The last year that the pharmacy examiner's salary was listed in the Iowa Official Register was 1931 and 32. His salary remained the same all of those years. George was reappointed by Governor Hamill in March of 1928. Governor Dan Turner announced George's 3-year reappointment to the Board of Pharmacy Examiners in 1931. In 1933, George became chairman of the Pharmacy Examiners. He was replaced by George Gilman as chairman 2 years later, although he remained a state pharmacy examiner. Governor Nelson Krashel appointed George to another 3-year term as pharmacy commissioner in 1937. His term as an examiner also ended that year. He spent a considerable amount of time traveling the state for meetings, examinations, and inspections. His travels took him most frequently to Des Moines, but also to Waterloo, Sioux City, Iowa City, Algona, and Northeast Iowa. In 1925, George was appointed to the National Association of Board of Pharmacy's Committee on Educational Standards. As a member of the State Board of Pharmacy Examiners, George was occasionally tasked to file charges related to drugs. Paul Graves of Madrid was arrested and pled guilty to the charge of illegally selling proprietary medicine without a license. George was also involved in a case in which H.T. Swenson of Cambridge became subject to purchasing a drug vendor's license as a salesman of minerals and chemical livestock foods. In August of 1925, the Old Daily Register announced that George was a vice presidential nominee for the American Pharmaceutical Association. He was elected by mail ballots of organization members in March of 1926. George traveled the nation as a delegate to national conventions. He represented Iowa at the American Pharmaceutical Association meetings in 1910, 1920, and 1930. He was elected as a delegate from the Iowa Pharmaceutical Association to the American Pharmaceutical Association's conventions in Rapid City, South Dakota, and in Baltimore in 1929 and 1930. He was appointed by Governor John Hamill to attend the annual conference of the Association of Dairy, Food, and Drug Officials held in Lincoln, Nebraska in September of 1929. He was also a representative to the National Boards of Pharmacy in Miami, Florida in 1931. George also traveled internationally to Toronto, Canada, as a delegate to the American Pharmaceutical Association in 1932. After having been a member of the American Pharmaceutical Association for 34 years, during which time George served as vice president and on various committees, he was appointed honorary president, one of the highest honors in the profession. George was a leader in the community of Ames, serving on many boards of directors and with his political party involvement. So, time for the next quiz. Which of the following boards was George an original member of? And you can clap if you think you know the right answer when I say it. Was it the Library Board? Ames City Council? So glad none of you picked that. He was not on that one, well before his time. Hospital Board? Union National Bank. Well, I'm pleased to tell you that although he was a member of the Union National Bank Board, he was not a founding member, but he was a founding member of both the library and the hospital board. George was appointed to the city council, by the city council to the city's board of censors in 1910, along with other community leaders. A few names that might sound familiar to you: L.C. Tilden, who was Ames mayor at one point, S.A. Knapp, and Mrs. A.B. Maxwell. Ames saw many World War I soldiers going to or coming from Camp Dodge in Des Moines because of the railroad. In 1917, the Ames Chamber of Commerce appointed a committee of local businessmen to work out plans and arrangements for feeding the soldiers. George was, of course, one of those businessmen. In 1918, George also became a member of the Movie Censor Board after the Faculty Women's Club protested Sunday movies. In 1903, Mayor Parley Sheldon appointed George as the vice president of the first library board. He served on that board with Mary Greeley. On June 8th of that year, the library board recommended to the city council to accept Mrs. Greeley's donation of land as a site for the library. During the dedication of the library, George, on behalf of the building committee of the library board, turned over the keys and building plans to the city and gave a brief account of the letting of the contract and construction of the library. Mrs. Judisch provided music at that event. George also assisted Dr. O.H. Cessna, president of the library board, in the final ceremony of putting the cornerstone in place. The library's 50th anniversary was held in 1954. As a former board member, George was given a special invitation to attend the celebrations, which included a talk, special music, and refreshments of cider and donuts on a Friday evening, followed by a Sunday afternoon tea to honor board and trustee members and library staff. Wallace Greeley, a captain in the Civil War, president of Union National Bank, and mayor of Ames from 1888 to 1890, founded Mary Greeley Hospital in memory of his wife. He personally chose the original board members, including George Judisch. The hospital was formally dedicated on September 24th, 1916, in front of 2,000 people. George was the representative of the board that accepted Captain Greeley's $3,000 check for equipping and furnishing the hospital. Mrs. Judisch was a member of the trio that sang at the event. Now, it is rumored that George was just given $600 and sent to Chicago to purchase equipment for the hospital. George served many terms on the board. He was elected as an officer of the board in May 1930, serving as superintendent just before being reappointed for a 6-year term in early June. He served as treasurer of the board in 1931 and served only as a member of the board the following year. In 1938, George Judisch and Seaman Knapp resigned from the board because state law made it impossible for a board member to sell products of his own business to the board. George, of course, was in the pharmacy business, while Mr. Knapp was in the insurance business. George served as a member of the board of Union National Bank for many years. As you can see from this photo, Wallace Greeley's bank, circled in red on the right, was just a few doors down from the Judisch Brothers Pharmacy. In January 1928, George was elected as vice president of the board of directors of the newly merged Union National Bank, which brought in Commercial Savings Bank and Union Trust and Savings. George was reelected as vice president the following year. He was also listed as a stockholder in the same newspaper article. George was reported as chairman of the board of the oldest bank in Ames in 1931. George was one of the prominent businessmen that was a member of the board of directors in 1932 when the decision was made to merge Story County Trust and Savings Bank to become Union Story Trust and Savings Bank. It was reported in 1933 that George was the chairman of the board of Union Story Trust and Savings Bank. In October of that year, E.J. Engeldinger, executive vice president, passed away just 7 weeks prior to Dr. Earl Rice, president of the board, leaving George Judisch as chairman and A.H. Munn, vice president, leaders of the board. In 1935, when George was elected president, his son, Louis, became a member of the board of directors. Both men retained their roles in many following years. All in all, George served on the board from 1902 to August of 1958, 6 months prior to his passing. By 1962, Union Story Trust and Savings Bank had 11 presidents in its 81 histories. George served as president from 1932 to 43, and then served as chairman from 1944 to 1958. George was very active in politics in Ames and Story County. The first mention of George's political service was in 1896 as a member of the Petit Jury for the United States Circuit Court for the Southern District of Iowa, Central Division. The last mention I saw of George was what you see here on the screen. During the 1954 election, George's photo was printed in the Ames Daily Tribune as one of the oldest voters at the age of 84. It was likely that he voted again before he passed away 5 years later. George was also active in the Grant Club. The Grant Club was the largest men's club in Iowa, as well as the best known and most politically influential. The club's origins were Republican, and the club was named after President Grant. In 1900, George was named an usher for the state convention along with more than 100 other members of the Grant Club. He also served on the reception committee for the Grant Club banquet that honored Governor Leslie M. Shaw at the end of his term in 1902. George was very active in the Republican Party in Story County. He served as first ward delegate to the county convention in 1928, 1930, 1932, 1934, and 1936. He was joined by his son Louis in 1930 and 1934. His daughter-in-law joined both of them in 1936. George also served as a delegate to the state Republican convention in March and July of 1928. George was also very active in city politics. In 1932, he was named chairman of the Get Out the Vote campaign by both Republicans and Democrats. Their goal was to create more interest in voters to go to the polls on Election Day. So maybe that's not a new problem. That same year, George served on a committee in the Hoover for President Club that arranged speakers in Ames within weeks prior to the election. JudischDrugstore served as a drop-off location for contributions to the campaign. George also served as a committee member for the local celebration of President Roosevelt's birthday in 1934. The party was held in the Memorial Union on January 30th. Tickets to the event were sold at JudischDrugstore. The major event of the day was a bridge tournament, and the national radio program was to broadcast while the tournament was in progress. George must have had a significant enough presence in the Republican Party that U.S. Senator L.J. Dickinson made a point to visit with George as he was passing through town via bus to return to his Algona home. George cared enough about politics to introduce the next generation. Each year, he sponsored the best high school civic student on a trip to the legislature in Des Moines. A few other high-ranking students were given a trip to the district court in Nevada. In 1923, his wife and son joined he and the other students during that trip to Nevada. George was pretty active in the community and was a member of a number of service clubs. So, clap when you think we have the right answer. Which club was George recognized as being a member of for 50 years? Was it the Masons? Was it the Ames Business Men's Association? Knights of Pythias? Rotary. So he was a member of each of those groups. He was a founding member of the Ames Business Men's Association and of Rotary, but he actually received 50-year recognition in the Masons and the Knights of Pythias. Please don't ask me what the Knights of Pythias are. I don't know. But apparently it was a big deal because he was a member for a real long time. George stayed active in the community due to his involvement in many service clubs. As I said, he was a charter member of the board of the Ames Business Men's Association in 1897, serving as the first vice president. In 1925, he served on the agricultural committee of the Ames Chamber of Commerce that put on Achievement Day for the Boys and Girls Club. George was also very active in Rotary. This photo shows him as one of the pioneer members of the club. And hopefully you can see George is in the back row. I circled him in red. So George was a pioneer member of the club. He was listed as the speaker multiple times in his local club. He gave a talk about the influence of spices on the discovery of America, including how spices were used to prepare medicines. That meeting was held at the Sheldon Munn Hotel in 1926. He also spoke on behalf of the retailer's perspective in a discussion on trade problems and returned goods. He also spoke about Dr. Martin Mortensen, head of the dairy department at Iowa State, during a program to honor the professor in 1935. George didn't just attend meetings of the Ames Rotary Club, he gave of his time also by serving on committees of the organization. Over his tenure in the club, he served on a program subcommittee, a competition relations subcommittee. There's a lot of committees, hang on here. The club history committee, the competitive relations committee, and the classification committee. George also visited and spoke at other Rotary clubs. He gave a program to the Women's Rotary Club here in Ames titled The History of Drugs. And he was most often cited as visiting the Nevada Club and addressing the club a few times while visiting. While in town on business, he addressed the Waterloo Rotary Club in 1928. He also spoke at a 1932 joint meeting of the Rotary and Kiwanis in Algona about the origin of drugs and their relation to medicine, and also told of some of the ancient cure-alls which produced much merriment among the listeners. I just love the way those old newspapers are worded. Later that same day, actually, he was the guest speaker at the Eagle Grove Rotary Club. George was deeply committed to local organizations. In 1940 was when he was honored with his 50-year certificate as a member of the Masonic Lodge. He was also recognized with not only a 50-year membership certificate, but also a lifetime membership in the Ames Knights of Pythias. George held many speaking engagements, some related to his profession and others not. He served as the Toastmaster of the annual veterinary banquet in Des Moines in 1911. He was the principal speaker of a meeting of druggists in northeastern Iowa in 1925. He spoke at a veterinary medical society meeting at Iowa State in 1931. The Tribune-Times pointed out that he'd taught materia medica and pharmacy in the veterinary division at Iowa State for 26 years. And it was assumably due to his profession that the health chairman of the Ames chapter business and professional women's club invited George to speak in 1932. He was also one of the 4 men to give brief talks on legislation and other business matters to the Boone and Story County group of the Iowa Pharmaceutical Association in 1938. Because he was a noteworthy citizen, he was also invited to speak at many other events. As a member of the college's trustees, George presented at Union College's exercises in Des Moines in June of 1920. Later that decade, he spoke to 140 men at the Gilbert's annual father-son banquet. That same year, he spoke at a farewell luncheon in honor of Mr. J.H. Daggett as he moved in his career with Chicago and Northwestern Railroad from Ames to Council Bluffs. Now, George, as a prominent citizen of Ames, regularly appeared in the local news section of the newspaper. If you've not had an opportunity to see some of these old newspapers, they put a lot of really interesting personal information in the local news section. So he was often listed as being out of town on business, most frequently to Des Moines. Although some of this personal news that was in there, in 1926, it was reported that his home was released from quarantine for diphtheria. Thankfully, it was many months later that George hosted a doctor friend from Amana in his home. He also hosted Dr. Root of the ER Squibb Company's research department when he spoke at Iowa State in 1928. So kind of interesting to see the different local news things that were reported in the paper. George was also listed as a guest at a number of local social events. He attended the pre-screening of the photoplay Sorrel and Son at the Capitol Theater. He was one of 26 parlor hosts at the reception celebrating the marriage of Dr. and Mrs. Kirk and Grace Stouter. Mark Twain Day was observed in Ames following a proclamation by the mayor on November 7, 1935. Many local residents gave statements concerning Mark Twain that were published in the paper that day. George was quoted as saying, "The works of Mark Twain have probably delighted youth as much, if not more, than those of any other American author. His description of life on the Mississippi during the steamboat days is very accurate. The worth of his writings is evidenced by the fact that his productions have been translated into a number of languages. His keen understanding of human nature and his truthful portrayal of its weaknesses probably accounts for the popularity of his works. George's out-of-state travels were also noted in the newspaper. He took a 10-day trip to Portland, Maine, Boston, Massachusetts, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1928. In 1935, he took a 2-week trip to Portland, Oregon, and California. Can you imagine if all of our vacations were listed in the newspaper today? George and his son Louis did a fair amount of traveling together and traveling to visit one another. They visited George's brothers in Muscatine in July of 1929. Later that month, they attended the funeral of their friend Frederick Meads in State Center. They traveled together to the Black Hills in South Dakota in 1930. In 1931 and 32, George and Louis traveled between Iowa City and Ames to visit one another, while Louis attended the University of Iowa. So a little more about George's family. Louis, his son, was married to Clara Mann, September 11th, 1935. Together, they had 3 children, George, Jennifer, and James. Louis became the eventual owner of his father's pharmacy. Together, Louis and Clara opened a law office, Judisch and Judisch. The law office was located at 209.5 Main Street, upstairs from the drugstore. Frank Jr., George's great-grandson, shared with me that his grandmother passed the bar exam before attending law school, and that she specialized in income tax. I spoke with Frank on the phone, and he shared with me that he recalled George living with them, and he fondly remembers playing gin rummy regularly with his grandfather. So I'm pleased to introduce to you Jim Judisch, George's grandson. Could we get the lights to come up a little bit?
Good evening. She was absolutely correct. You can't see a thing except the light shining in your eyes. I'm very pleased to be here this evening to talk about my grandfather, but more importantly, I was hoping that we could have questions from the audience on what kinds of things would you like to know about. Please remember that when he died, I was 17 years old, so I knew him only as an older man. And I was very fortunate to be able to see some of the people that he knew. For example, you were talking about Gilman, and Harry Gilman was from, or George Gilman, I'm sorry, I believe was from Fort Dodge, and he would stop by and see my grandfather quite frequently. Pat Patterson would come by all the time, and he was still on the Board of Pharmacy Examiners, and we would see him quite frequently as well. But the thing that I remember so much about my grandfather was he was always educating people. And as you explained, he was a Mason for over 50 years. Do many of you know much about Masonry? Do many of you care about Masonry? Masonry is, if you will, one of the oldest networking fraternal organizations around. And my grandfather really exemplified that. I mean, you heard about all of the things that he did. Did any of you catch what his formal education was? 8th grade. Not bad, right? And this was a guy who learned how to do things by listening to other people, performing the tasks, and then going out and doing them. As a chief anesthesiologist for the Rock Island Railroad, do you understand what that meant? You either got the guy blind drunk so you could cut his leg off, or you found some chloroform and gassed him with it. You didn't have any of the wonderful things that were today. I mean, this was kind of crude surgery back then, but it saved lives. And you had a lot of amputees as a result of that. My grandfather would talk very fondly of the sloughs of Muscatine and muskmelons. He always loved his muskmelons. And he would, the Mark Twain analogy, I think, was very, very cogent, because he would talk about the wonderful times that he and his dog Shep would go out into the sloughs hunting with his .22 rifle, and his brothers Al and Henry. It was really a very delightful, almost Mark Twain-esque kind of a relationship as they grew up. My grandfather also was very much into the people of Ames. And one of the things that I think was so fascinating about him too was that, you remember, Ames was basically the end of the Underground Railroad. And with that, we had a lot of blacks for a small town of Ames. Now, please understand, I've spent my last 40 plus years in Rochester, Minnesota. Ames was far more integrated and far more inclusive as a kid growing up than Rochester was when I got there 20 years later. In Rochester, if you were black, you could only stay in one hotel. And Rochester had people like Louis Armstrong coming to town, all sorts of dignitaries. They were not allowed in anything except the Avalon Hotel. In Ames, there was really only 2 hotels anyway, so you could stay wherever you wanted. And we had with us, and my grandfather's dotage, a woman that we called Martine. Her last name after her last divorce, or before her last divorce, was Martin. And Viola Martin was with us until she died just a year or so before George did. And so, we were very cognizant of the blacks in our community. What kinds of questions do you guys have? If not, we can get right to the drawing too, but go ahead.
I've got a microphone if anyone has a question or a comment. Does anyone have a particular memory of Judisch Brothers Drugstore on Main Street that you'd like to relate? Anybody?
Can I tell you one dirty story? I was 12 years old in the drugstore, and a young man came in, and I said, "Can I help you, sir?" And he said, "Is there a pharmacist around?" I said, "Well, no, I'm can I help you?" He said, "I need some prophylactics." Now, I had heard them called all sorts of things, but never prophylactics. So what did I do? "Hey, Mom, this man wants some prophylactics." I've never seen my mother move so fast. I've never seen a man get so red so fast. Later on, I found out what he was really after. The store itself was a unique thing. I just want to mention a couple of things about that. Do you realize that there was not a full basement in the store? It had to all be hand dug, so you only had a partial basement in the back end. And when you came into that, there were trap doors to get the big chemicals that would come in. They would bring in carboys of acid. You would have hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, and all of those would just go down the basement and get poured down there. And then you had a tunnel that went in kind of the middle of the store all the way out to the street with just some little block work. I don't know what that, it must still exist that way. To get to the offices of my mother and father, and by the way, my father was first partnered with Skeeter Hirschberg. My mother didn't join in the firm until she passed the bar exam. Incidentally on that, have any of you ever heard of a Sears and Roebuck lawyer? Clara Judisch was the last Sears and Roebuck lawyer to ever be elected into or inculcated into the bar of Iowa, and that simply meant that she had studied in a law office and then had to pass the same test that anyone else would do. To get to the Judisch and Judisch law offices, you had to go up a stairway. Well, the stairway was carved out of the Coast to Coast building, which was right to the, west. And when you went up to there, the floor for the Coast to Coast building was actually higher than the floor for the Judisch Brothers Drugstore. So they had to build up where the Judisch and Judisch law office was by 3 more steps, and it was all built on a platform in that particular building. I know you're just fascinated to hear all that. Any other questions?
But just a comment, Shannon mentioned that the former Judisch Brothers Drugstore is now it's all about me. And when that building was renovated, for that business, or for the business that they're seated in. The entire structure inside was stripped out so that when you step in, it's a full 2-story open space. But if you look up to your left after you step into the door, you can still see the door to the former Judisch law office.
Which was reversed.
Floating up there.
It was reversed.
It was reversed.
Yeah. What you see is what the door looked like if you had gone up the stairs and were looking at it the other way. But it's still there, and
But
it's just,
still there, you can see it. You can still see it.
and I would be glad to bring the Judisch and Judisch law sign back if anyone wants that for the History Center.
That would be wonderful.
Okay.
Wonderful. You mentioned that Lewis took over after George. Is that the historical fact?
It was actually Clara and Lewis. It was mostly my mother that really wanted it. My father didn't want it at all.
And then how long did they remain in business after he took over?
It was closed down. It was sold before, what happened is that before the remodeling, it had been sold to G&M, Geezer and Messer. And then when they failed with it, Mother took it back over, remodeled it, and it ran for another couple of years. When did it close?
It's funny that you asked that question. Just yesterday, we were trying to figure out when it closed, and it was hard to find. What we found was the last ad I found in the newspaper
It was about 57?
was
56?
I wrote this down. There we go.
Yeah.
Was October of 1956, and the Judisch Pharmacy was in the 1956 phone book, but not 1957.
So probably in
So
56,
somewhere
yeah.
late 56, early 57 was our best guess.
I think that's a good guess. And all the prescriptions went over to, does anyone remember Oslin Drugs? That went over to Oslin Drugs. And what happened to Oslin Drugs? And is Rexall Drugs still going? They're gone too, huh? And Fasco is gone. Ken York was a wonderful friend of mine from Fasco Drugs, but I won't bore you with that either. Any other questions?
Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
What did his children do and in terms of education and vocation?
You mean the three of us? My father had 3 children, but George only had 1. So you know who Lewis was. And then the 3 of us, my brother Frank, we called him Butch, my sister Jennifer, and myself. I am the only real doctor in the family because I've got a PhD, and my brother and sister are both MDs, and when I tried to pull that off on them, you notice I only do that when they aren't here. They point out, you may be the only real doctor, but would you like to compare bank statements? Which quickly puts me back in my place, way down there as the lowest of the 3 children. My brother was an ophthalmologist both in private practice and also with the State University of Iowa Medical Hospital. My sister spent the bulk of her career in academic medicine at the University of Florida, South Florida in Tampa. And I spent my first 25 years with IBM. I was about, I think, the only child psychologist that IBM had, but my point is that if you understand children, you can understand management with one big exception. Children, usually you can tell when they're lying. With management, they really get a lot better at it. And what I did there was human factors engineering, trying to help engineers do it right instead of not doing it right. And for about the last 20 years, my son and I have been involved in basically lighting. How do you do energy efficient lighting programs? And again, it's a human factors thing. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question for you. You perhaps remember Edith Sunderland. I'm sure there are people in the
So
audience
well.
who do.
Edith was a very dear friend of
Edith was
mine.
one of my teachers, and then we worked together for many years in the child development department. And she used to describe you as the only student they ever had who came to a 2-year-old program in the child development laboratories and then later did your master's in the child development department. Am I remembering that accurately?
Well, I don't remember what I did it to, but I will apologize. But yes, I started out very, very young there, and I think I was also the first male to graduate with a BS in child development. That was in 1962, and then I got my master's under Glenn Hawkes, Bruce Gardner, Anita Sunderland, and also, do you remember not Edith Lilly, her mother, Alice Lilly, and Damaris Pease, of course. But Glenn Hawkes was a very, very special friend of mine, as well as Bruce Gardner. But yeah, Edith Sunderland was just great. Any other questions?
Or comments? Well, if there are none, the last piece of business is having Shannon draw the name for the door prize.
While Kathy's on her way up, I'll make my final comments. And that's that the city of Ames was fortunate that George Judisch chose to make his home here for 65 years. He passed away February 1st, 1959 at the age of 88. Certainly the community benefited from his leadership, philanthropy, and business, but the community also earned a good reputation by the way that George positively represented Ames in his interactions within Story County, Iowa, the United States, and even internationally.
Thank you, Shannon. Let's give Shannon a round of applause.
Well done, as always, Shannon. Fabulous job. Okay, mix these up real well. Dennis Clute, are you here? Stop out to the, oh, right there. Stop out to the little shop table and pick up your bag of wonderful Onondaga roast coffee.
Did you want to talk about the next?
The lecture number 2 in the series will be on Tuesday, April 28th. Lisa Ocean is going to come up from DMAC and talk about the Depression years in Iowa. And Lisa did a talk for us, it's been a few years ago now, on the home fronts of Iowa during World War II. And she just did an outstanding job, and I know that this program from Lisa is going to be really wonderful. So we hope to see you on Tuesday, April 28th, also 7 p.m. right here in City Auditorium. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and we'll see you in April.